Hello and welcome to Apex Math. Today we're going to talk about how to find the exact trigonometric ratios. We're going to stick with sine, cosine, and tangent, but it's easy to apply the same logic to the other three trig ratios if those are required for you as well. You just need to find the reciprocal if you're trying to find those trig ratios. So we're going to use some shortcuts that I know, but there's still a long process to go through in order to be able to do these exact trig ratios. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we need to know is we need to know our cheat sheet table. And that is, what are the main trig ratios for sine and cosine? And the way I do that is I use just a little table that helps me remember the main ones for sine and cosine. And then, of course, tangent is simply the ratio of sine over cosine. So our main trig ratios are going to be for 0, 30, 45, 60, and 90. So that's how we're going to build our table, is with these values here. So start off by writing those, and then over here you're going to have your sine and your cosine. Now, the way I build these, rather than trying to just memorize the entire table, is I use a pattern. Patterns are a great way to memorize things in mathematics if you're not a good memorizer of just random facts. So the way I memorize this pattern is that I start off with writing simply 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because that's easy to do. And then I simply divide each of these numbers by 2. Then the next step is I'm going to take the square root of each of the numerators and reduce it. So let me pick a different color. Now, if I take the square root of 0, I get 0. So I don't have to do anything here. If I take the square root of 1, I get 1. So I don't need to do anything here. For this guy, I have to take the square root of 2. It doesn't simplify, so I have to leave the square root on there. For the square root of 3, again, it doesn't simplify, so I have to leave that on there. For the square root of 4, the square root of 4 is equal to 2. So this becomes the value 2. Now, there's a couple things I can reduce down further, because 0 over 2 is actually just equal to 0. 0 over anything is equal to 0. And 2 over 2 is equal to 1. So that's how I have my table. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Take the square root of each of the numerators and reduce them. Divide it by 2 and then reduce each fraction. For cosine, you simply write everything backwards. So I start with the 1, then I write square root 3 over 2, square root 2 over 2, 1/2, and 0. So it's simply sine backwards. So this is what we're going to refer to when we are finding our exact trigonometric ratios. And of course, tangent is going to be the ratio of sine over cosine. So 0 over 1 is 0. 1/2 over square root of 3 over 2. The denominators cross off, and I have 1 over the square root of 3. But we can't leave it that way because we have to rationalize our denominator. So we write it as square root of 3 over 3. Square root of 2 over 2 over square root of 2 over 2, well, that's something over itself, so that's just equal to 1. For this guy, again, cross off the denominators because they're both 2s. So I get square root of 3 over 1. Anything over 1 is itself, so I just get 3. And this is 1 over 0, and anything over 0 is undefined. So I get an undefined answer there. So that would be my row for tangent. All right, so that's step 1, is making sure we have memorized our cheat sheet table. Step 2 is making sure you know how to find your reference angles. And we won't go into detail on how to find those. That's another video if you need to look that up. But your magic numbers for finding reference angles are 180 and 360. Basically, you take whatever numbers you're given that if they're not already a 0, 30, a 60, 45, or a 90, one of the ones in our table there, you either subtract 180, subtract it from 180, or subtract 180 from it, or subtract it from 360 multiple times, whatever you need to do with these two numbers with the subtraction in order to, so you're going to use subtraction. Subtraction in those two numbers until you get a number that looks like one of these. So, oops, I forgot my 60. So, that's how you find your reference angles, is subtraction in those two numbers. All right. Next, step 3 is making sure you know in what quadrants are your trig functions positive or negative. And so to remember that, you remember all students take calculus. So all trig functions are positive here. For students, S stands for sine, so your sine is positive there. T stands for tangent, so your tangent is positive there. And C for calculus stands for cosine, so your cosine is there. And remember that when we're looking at angles, we're building up from 0 going in this direction if it's positive. And this would be 90 degrees here. This would be 180 degrees here, 270 degrees here. Now, if we have a negative, sometimes we can ask to find cosine of negative 60 degrees. Well, that means instead of going in this direction, we go in the opposite direction. So a negative makes us move this way, clockwise. So the sign here determines which way you're moving, whether you're moving counterclockwise or clockwise. All right, so that's the third thing you want to remember. So let's go ahead and look at a problem. So let's start off with a simple one. Actually, that reminds me of one more thing that we should think about, is what happens when you're given radians. Most of us like to work in degrees rather than radians. So if you're working in radians and you don't know all your radian measures and you prefer to work in degrees, remember that you can convert from radians to degrees, which is what I like to do. Convert from radians to degrees simply by multiplying by 180 over pi. So feel free to do that if you prefer to work in degrees and if your brain works better thinking in degrees than trying to remember where you are on your coordinate system, that this is 0, this is pi over 2, this is pi, etc. Working with radians. So let's move on. So let's say we have sine, we'll start off one with radians, sine of pi over 4. So the first thing we want to do is I like to put it in degrees. Again, you don't have to do that. That's up to you, something I like to do. So I'm going to make the radians go away. And I always remember that the pi is going to go down here because I know it has to cross off and I want it to go away. So I always remember that the pi goes in the denominator and pi is equal to 180. So I know that the 180 always has to go on top because this is like multiplying by 1. So if I multiply that times 180 over pi, the pi's cross off and then I would divide 4 into 180. 4 goes into 4 once, 4 goes into 180 45 times. So I'm simply finding the sine of 45 degrees. Now that is already in my first quadrant and on my chart, so I don't have to do much more work there. I simply have to, I don't have to find its reference angle. So I'm going to look on the chart. And if I look on the chart that we made at the very beginning, we will see that the sine of 45 degrees is square root of 2 over 2. And then I'm going to check the sine, the other kind of sine, the SIGHN sine. And of course we know that in quadrant 1, which is where we are, all are positive, so therefore it's going to be a positive square root 2 over 2. So this one was pretty easy because once we converted it from radians to degrees, we were already in that first quadrant. So let's pick one that's a little bit harder now. Let's do sine of 300. So the first thing we're going to do, we don't have to convert it to degrees because it's already in degrees. So what we're going to do here is the first thing is we're going to find its reference angle. And remember we said to find the reference angle, we're going to use either 180 or 360 and do some magic with one of those two numbers so that we subtract and get a number in the first quadrant. So I can see that if I take the number 360 and I subtract 300, that will give me a number in that first quadrant. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. 360 minus 300 gives me 60. So that's my reference angle. So step number 2 is to find the sine of that reference angle. So the sine of 60 degrees is square root of 3 over 2. But now I have to decide, is it positive or negative? So I have to look at the SIGHN sign. So I have to look and say, well, where is 300 degrees? What quadrant is that in? So if I look here, well, this is 90 degrees. Remember, I'm moving in this direction here. This is 180. This gets me to 270. So 300 degrees is going to be over here in quadrant 4. And if I write out my all students take calculus, I know that the cosine is what's positive in that quadrant. And I have the sine, not the cosine. So therefore, I have to make this a negative since I have the sine. And so my answer is negative square root 3 over 2. All right, we're going to try another one here. Let's do a tangent one. Let's do tangent of 120 degrees. Tangent of 120. All right, so we don't need to convert to degrees because we're already in degrees. So the first thing I need to do is find that reference angle. So I'm going to look to my magic numbers, 360 and 180. Which one can I use to give me a number in my first quadrant? Well, if I do 180 minus 120, that will work. And 180 minus 120 gives me 60 degrees. So I'm going to use that as my reference angle. So now I need to find, since tangent is sine over cosine, I either have it written out in my table and did it so that I can see my tangent, or if I just wrote out my sine and my cosine on my table, then I can just do sine of 60 over cosine 60. So the sine of 60 was square root of 3 over 2. The cosine of 60 is 1 over 2. The over 2 parts just cross each other off because they're the same. So I end up with square root 3 over 1, which is just a plain square root 3. So now I need to find out if it's a positive or a negative. So again, I have to look at where does 120 fall on my chart. So I'm going to start here. I say this is 90. This is 180. Oops, I've gone too far. I want 120. It's right in here. So I'm in quadrant 2. 4. And so this is all students. So the sign is positive in quadrant 2. So my tangent is not going to be positive. So my answer is going to be a negative square root 3. All right, so let's take a look at one that's a negative. All right, let's look at the tangent of negative 13 pi over 6. So the first thing we'll do is we'll convert it into degrees. So 13 pi over 6 times 180 over pi. Pi's cross off. 6 goes into 6 once, 6 goes into 18 3 times, so this becomes a 30. And I have 13 times 180, which becomes 390 degrees. So now I need my reference angle. So my reference angle is going to be 390. I'm going to do minus 360 because that will get me in the right quadrant here, and I get 30 degrees. Now I need to figure out the sine. So if I look at 390, but moving in the opposite direction because we have a negative. Well, 360, I went all the way around in this direction, and then I went an extra 30 degrees. So I ended up here in quadrant 4. And if we look at what's positive there, we have all students take calculus. Cosine is positive. So I know that I'm going to have, since it's tangent, I'm going to have a negative number. So I want a negative answer. So I need my sine of 30 over my cosine of 30. And that ends up being square root 3 over 3. Because you end up, remember, getting 1 over the square root of 3. And you have to rationalize that into square root of 3 over 3. So our final answer becomes negative square root 3 over 3. So just to review the steps that we need to do is 1, make sure you know how to draw your table. Step 2, if you aren't comfortable with radians, make sure you can convert to degrees. By multiplying by 180 over pi. Step 3, find your reference angles. And remember, your magic numbers for that are 180 and 360 and somehow using subtraction. And 4 is using your all students take calculus to find the SIGHN to make sure that you have the right sign of your answer. And that's all you really need to do. The 5th one is remember that if you have a negative, to go in the opposite direction. When you're finding, for number 4, when you're finding your sign. So instead of going up and around, we're going to go down and to the left. So those are the steps involved with finding your exact trig ratios. I hope this helped summarize it and make it easier for you. Please like us. It helps make our videos more available to other students. So please like us at Apex Math. And any comments on any future videos that you'd like to see, we'd love to hear from you. And have a great day.